Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the White House. We are excited to have you guys here today, both for a wonderful movie screening, but also to first dig in and talk about issues around trauma and resilience and school discipline and juvenile justice, all issues that have been at the core of a lot of the work that we've been doing here with the Council on Women and Girls and at the Department of Justice. So I first want to introduce my boss, the fearless leader of the Council on Women and Girls. She's executive director to the council, but also serves as assistant to our president and chief of staff to our first lady. So welcome to the stage, Ms. Tina Chen.
Well, good evening, and welcome to the White House. I apologize for being a little late. Sometimes the days at the White House get a little busy. We were over celebrating our Joining Forces initiative over in the East Room, but I wanted to make sure to be here for this session today. This issue, and I have to acknowledge Kalisha DeSouza, because Kalisha is, our senior policy advisor to the White House Council on Women and Girls. She's been an amazing force behind the work that we've been doing for the last several years on women and girls of color. So please give Kalisha a round of applause. We have always been focused on women and girls of color since we started the Council on Women and Girls in 2009. One of the first executive orders the president signed in March of that year was the executive order that created the Council on Women and Girls, with Valerie Jarrett as the chair and myself as executive director. And we both continued in those roles the entire 8 years of the administration. And most recently, in the last several years, we made a particular point of taking a look at the intersectional issues facing women and girls of color. Both in school discipline, what we're going to talk about today, on the economic front, on things like unplanned pregnancies, on the particular victimization that sometimes women and girls of color are facing, the barriers they have, but the incredible promise and empowerment that also our women and girls of color have, and the great work that they are doing in creating businesses and jobs and in pursuing careers in STEM, and how much the promise of the future of our country depends on these women and girls achieving their full potential. And it's something we all remain committed to, and making sure that they achieve that full potential. And tonight's session, and I have to thank you all, first of all, for coming late at night on a Monday evening to do this, but it is a demonstration of how committed I know you all are to these girls. Because what we now know about what happens when children experience trauma is that it affects them. And I am really so interested in this film and the work and the research behind it. And I want to thank James Redford, who's here, for this film and for putting it together for us. Because we now know the science behind what many of you who are practitioners have known for many years, that when kids experience trauma, when anyone experiences trauma, that affects them, and it affects them in a lot of ways, and it can lead to issues like school discipline, and it can lead to things like, we know, the disproportionate effect on our girls of color, getting excluded from school. We know, for example, that although black girls are 8% of enrolled students, they're 14% of the students who receive out-of-school suspensions. And when kids are excluded from school, or when they are not getting the trauma-informed care that they need, that sends them on a spiral, and can often send them on a downward spiral, except that we now know better, and we have the science behind us to know better. And we are, so grateful, again, to all of you who have been doing this work, have been representing these women and girls, who are fighting for them every day. And I'm particularly grateful, to our Department of Justice colleagues, who are here, who've led the way on this for the last 8 years, and our Department of Education. This is something that has been a whole of administration effort, together with the not-for-profit sector, for you great advocates, to incredibly courageous young women and girls who have spoken their truth and their stories, out loud. And tonight is a continuation of that work. It is, again, so excited about this film and how broadly this film will communicate that message, and really change the culture, change our cultural attitudes around how we affect trauma, how we deal with trauma-affected folks, and how we move forward in this area. This is a commitment that we all share as individuals with all of you. It's something that I can stand up here and say, as someone who did a lot of this work before I came to this building and will continue to do a lot of this work after I leave this building. As I've been telling a lot of people, we've only been fortunate these last 8 years to have an opportunity to do the work from here in this building. But this is not the only place you do this work. And we are all committed to continuing to do this work in all the many places in which it needs to happen. So with that, I will turn this back over to Kalisha. I again want to thank you all for being here tonight, but also take the opportunity as we close out this administration to thank you all for the work that you have done. Many of you I know for many years in leading the way on this, for the work that you will continue to do for our communities in the years going forward. This is not, the achievements that we have had here these last 8 years could not have been done without all of you and without your leadership, your advocacy, your voices, your caring for our communities and for our kids. So as my concluding remark, I just want to say thank you. Thank you all so very much.
Before we get started with our film, I'd like to welcome up our panelists to lead us in our discussion. So first, our moderator, Catherine Pierce, who's joining us from the Department of Justice. Robert Listenby, the Administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the Department of Justice. Assistant Attorney General at the Department, Ms. Carol Mason. Executive Director of the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality, Rebecca Epstein. From the Yale School of Medicine, Dr. Stephen Morans. The very fearless pediatrician and CEO of the Center for Youth Wellness, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. And the reason that we're all gathered here today, our film director of Resilience, Mr. James Redford.
So good evening, everybody. I'd like to start doing what we're calling a popcorn round very quickly, asking each of the panelists to let us know who you are and what you do. And I'm going to start with Jamie down there at the end.
My name is Jamie Redford. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I deal with issues on the social and environmental front and believe very much in the power of stories to play a role being a helpful tool for change. That's what I do.
Good evening. My name is Carol Mason. I'm the Assistant Attorney General at the Office of Justice Program. You pushed the button. And I will say that I'm diverging a little bit from what Catherine said to say. But I will tell you that I was here in March when the President announced and signed the order creating the Council on Women and Girls. And I was at the Department of Justice when Dr. Marans came in to talk to then Attorney General Eric Holder about the impact of violence on children. So this is a wonderful evening to be able to demonstrate to you all that these issues have been at the forefront of this administration for 8 years. And I've just been privileged to be part of it by leading the Office of Justice programs, of which OJJDP is a part of. So thank you for having me.
I'm Stephen Marans. I'm a child and adult psychoanalyst and the director of the Childhood Violent Trauma Center at the Yale University School of Medicine, Yale Child Study Center.
Good evening. My name is Bob Listenby. I'm the administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And I had the good fortune to work for Carol Mason, starting off as co-chair of the Attorney General's National Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence before joining the department. Dr. Marans was a member of that task force as well, and we were guided by Ms. Catherine Pierce. So very happy to be here and talk about this issue that's so important to our young people.
I'm Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. I'm a pediatrician at the Bayview Child Health Center, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Youth Wellness in San Francisco. Thank you.
I'm Rebecca Epstein, and I'm the executive director of the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality, which is housed on the campus of Georgetown Law across town.
Thanks, everybody. And I'm Catherine Pierce. I'm a senior advisor to Bob. So, Jamie, what prompted you to produce not only one, but two films on this topic, Paper Tigers and Resilience?
Well, it started really, my partners, producing partners on both films, Dana Schwartz and Karen Pitzker, who are here, They sent me this interesting piece of research called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and I read it as a dry piece of research, but I think there was, I think Karen had like an exclamation point on a Post-it note. And from there, I mean, the question was, what's the best approach? What's needed to tell stories that we thought could be effective? And truthfully, we just felt that there are so many dimensions and aspects that if we tried to cover everything in one film, it wouldn't work. It would actually be boring, as counterintuitive as that may sound. But so we broke it into pieces, and Paper Tigers deals with more of the educational aspect of it, whereas Resilience, which you'll see tonight, is more of a sort of, I would say, like a documentary essay in chapters, really trying to lay it out in a way that can reach people, you know, factually and hopefully a little bit more deeply than that as well. And, you know, between the two films, our company, KPJR Films, is positioned to make it available to anyone that feels it could help them in their work.
Great, thank you. So Dr. Burke-Harris, why and how have adverse childhood experiences, trauma, toxic stress, and youth violence collectively become one of our biggest public health problems?
That's a great question, and I think that we know that childhood adversity, child trauma, stress has been, as I often will say, it's been going on since God was a boy. We know that these things are not new, but what is new is our understanding of exactly how they affect the health and development of children and over the lifetime. And with that science, we now have the tools to be able to understand how we need to respond with things like, the science shows us that early detection and early intervention makes a big difference because we have the opportunity to take advantage of brain development and development of the body, the immune system, and hormonal systems in healing ways. So instead of waiting for symptoms to show up, we have the opportunity to screen and then intervene early. And the science is showing us now more than we ever have before. I mean, the advances in MRI studies, genetics and epigenetics, understanding of all the different systems in the body gives us much better ability to detect, to establish the connection between early adversity and long-term health outcomes, and that is what we really are taking advantage of now.
Carol, few would disagree that trauma and stress are bad for kids, but as we'll see, the message brought home by Resilience is that the problem goes deeper than what we see on the surface. What's the point of drawing attention to something so self-evident?
Well, the nice thing is everybody here, I think we're preaching to the choir in terms of the relationships, but what we're hoping to do is empower you all to figure out how to use what we already know and really take it back to communities and bring some action to it. So what's wonderful now is that the science is matching up with the law, and the courts, prosecutors, systems, schools are understanding the connection now between children's exposure to violence and other outcomes with children. So one of the things that we've done in all of this work, we've been trying to figure out how do we bring the resources to bear across the administration to help counteract the impact of children's exposure to violence. So one of the things that I hope that some of you all will see tomorrow, I think there's some overlap in some of the audience, we have developed a tool called Changing Minds, which will give all of you all the information about what role every single individual can play in changing the life of a child who's been exposed to violence. And we know from the research that those are the kids who tend to act up in school. They tend to show up in different ways, and it's often, it's not the only way, but it's often a precursor to getting entangled in the criminal justice system. And so we know how to break this cycle. And we have the research now to prove it. And so the question is, where do you make your interventions? And every one of you has a role that you can play in breaking this cycle that Dr. Burke talked about, Dr. Burke Harris and Dr. Marins will talk about. So we hope that the film shows you the resilience of children, that once they've had this exposure, you don't write them off. There's brain development tells us that up through the mid-20s, you can change the course of someone's behavior. Actually, you can always change it. I hope you'll tell us that. You can always change the course of your behavior.
Thank you. So Dr. Marins, in your work on children exposed to violence, are there major elements of trauma that you can identify for us? And how is trauma, different types of trauma, how are they different? And in other words, how would you map trauma in a child's life?
I'm going to respond to the question by taking off from what my colleagues have already commented on. And to begin with, the idea of thinking about trauma is not about usual anxiety. And what are the characteristics? Well, the characteristics are the realization of the worst nightmare themes that everyone in this room knows about, with no anticipation, no ability to prepare. And that when we're confronted and we lose control over the circumstances that are so horrific, our minds, our brains operate differently. The neurophysiologic dysregulation doesn't stop with the end of the situation over which we've lost control. But there's a secondary loss of control, and that occurs when our bodies have normal reactions and our psychological attempts to regain control lead to symptoms. So that kids at various points in life are not only confronted with the realization of their worst nightmares, but they are then left continuing to feel out of control. We've actually learned so much, not only about the early timing that Dr. Burke Harris was talking about, but about the different phases of response that actually do become and can be a roadmap for how we intervene. But there's a first step, and that is that all of us know the experience of the get thee behind me, that what I can't stand to see, I don't want to look at, and what is horrifying and reminds us of our own vulnerability is the hardest thing to tolerate seeing in others. And there's a piece that maybe everyone in this room also knows about, which is the sense of hopelessness that follows the repeated and ongoing experience of losing control and not being able to regain it. We also know, though, that the protective factors, when they're applied at different phases, in the earliest acute moments, when things happen, in the peritraumatic period, in the weeks and months that follow, and then in the longer term, that there are ways of helping kids and adults regain control. And the two most powerful predictors of good outcomes and returning to the optimal path of development are the kids and adults who are traumatized seen and recognized? And then, following, do they have the social supports that are necessary? The good news is that we've developed intervention strategies, not only that are displayed in the Changing Minds campaign and that emerge in the film you're about to see, but also in ways that actually using evidence-based treatments can determine and have been effective in interrupting and preventing the development of post-traumatic stress disorder and related phenomena. The hard part is that we need to get the word out that there is hope so that we can take the blinders off, so that we can take advantage of our science, our interventions, and the notion that all of us together can have a place and a role in helping people regain control of their lives.
Thank you. So now let's turn specifically to the role that trauma and adverse childhood experiences play in our schools and in our juvenile justice system. Rebecca. The Center on Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown Law School has partnered with the White House in highlighting trauma in children who are disciplined at school. Would you describe that work and what that partnership looks like?
Sure. We've been really grateful to partner with the White House on a couple of different projects in those areas. One of them is that the Center on Poverty is partnering with the National Black Women's Justice Institute to look at the relationship between girls of color in particular and school-based police officers or school resource officers, SROs for short. My boss thought that meant standing room only, but it means school resource officers. So we partnered with the White House, who was instrumental in kicking off the project by inviting law enforcement at all 3 levels of government to talk about constructively moving forward. We're not looking so much at blame and what's happened in the past, but we're looking for ways forward. So Monique Morris and I have been traveling in the South to conduct focus groups and interviews with police officers and with girls of color to try to find a way forward, and the White House has been very supportive of our work. And it's our hope that we'll produce some guidelines going forward. But the second project that I would want to highlight happened in this room in September, which was a conference that was the result of months and months of work on trauma, the importance of trauma-informed schools, and with a particular focus on girls of color. So our co-hosts of that event were the National Crittenden Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education, as well as the Council on Women and Girls. And thanks to the efforts of the White House and the Department of Education, we were able to secure the attendance of teams from 15 different state school systems to come here and to learn about ACEs and other forms of trauma and the importance of trauma-informed approaches throughout their schools. And we were very encouraged. At the end of the day, they stood up and they talked about developing action plans moving forward to really engage in this work.
Great. So, Dr. Burkeris, I think at that very conference last September, you made a comment referring to the millions of children who've experienced trauma that really resonated with the audience. And that was, our children are not broken. How can we support that message, and how can we act to change this perception and generate innovative approaches that are seen as developmental and supportive rather than fixes for broken children?
Sure. So my statement was based on the research and the data that we saw within our practice, that the negative outcomes or the behavioral symptoms that we saw among our patients were directly related to exposure to toxic doses of adversity. And one of the things that I thought of after you just asked me that previous question is a recognition that when it comes to the impact of adverse childhood experiences on health and development of children, some of the consequences are apparent, like behavior, learning, impulse control, and some of them, or at least they seem apparent, and some of them are much less apparent, and that's what the science gives us an opportunity to understand. On the way over here today, I grabbed the most recent edition of the journal Pediatrics as I was running out the door, which is the foremost journal that every pediatrician reads. And they had a special section about cancer, how we can prevent cancer in the long term. And this is one of the things that I think is very, very important, which is that preventing and doing prevention and early intervention around adverse childhood experiences not only has an important impact on development and behavior and learning of children, but this is something that we all need to understand and get behind, because keep in mind that having an ACE score of 4 or more increases the risk of 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. That includes heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and this is a very wide tent. Anyone who cares about reducing healthcare costs, reducing the $2.9 trillion that the United States spends every year on healthcare, needs to understand the impact of ACEs on our health. And when we begin to think about the scope and scale, if you are an employer, you are paying for this in your healthcare premiums. If you are a parent, if you are a policymaker, right? This is profoundly impacting our economy, and the health and well-being of our society. And what we understand that the science shows us is that early identification and effective intervention can prevent the progression from early adversity to a litany of adverse outcomes. And that is why this science is so important, and it informs directly what our mandate is moving forward, which is make sure that every child in the United States of America is screened and has access to early and high-quality interventions, because we simply can't afford not to do that.
Yeah. So, given all of that, Carol, and given the agency that you lead, which focuses on criminal and juvenile justice, what is the connection between everything that Dr. Burke-Harris just said and trauma, I mean, including trauma and toxic stress and ACEs and all of it, on involvement in the juvenile justice system?
So we know that from the research, there's a study that we funded with the CDC called the National Survey on, we call it NatSEVS, National Survey on Children's Exposure to Violence. And the data shows that 60% of kids have had some exposure to violence, either as witnesses or victims of violence. So that's a huge number. As a former Attorney General Holder used to say, if that number, 60% of adults were impacted by some disease in that range, we would be doing something about it. So it's something we need to address and focus on. And it is one of the ways, again, that we can keep kids out of our criminal justice system and out of our juvenile justice system. And I know that we've talked about the school-to-prison pipeline, or I prefer to use the anecdote, which is supportive school discipline environment. The model that we have used in this administration is how to bring everybody to the table across silos. And Dr. Marins has been modeling this work for years. It's no secret that's what we copied from when we created the Defending Childhood Initiative, is looking at ways across systems that we can identify kids who've had exposure to violence, bring the right resources to those children, young people, to keep them out of our criminal and juvenile justice systems. So for example, and I've sat in on the call-ins, the meetings that they do at Yale, when a child is exhibiting certain behavior in school, instead of asking, why are you doing this, you dig in and find out what's wrong, what's going on in that child's life. What is causing this behavior? Oftentimes it may be, at home that they're not getting the food they need. They're not getting the sleep. They've been exposed to violence, and so get to the root cause of what's going on in that child's life. And then the second thing is bringing the resources to bear to make sure that child has what he or she needs to get back on track. Because we all benefit when we look at these things from a public health perspective and from a systemic perspective of figuring out what do we need to give this child an opportunity to succeed. Because that's what we all want, is all of our young people to have the chance that we all have to come here to the White House, to be able to be teachers, doctors, lawyers, sanitation workers, everything. And finding out what's impeding their ability is critical, and we want to see them. We want to make sure that we reduce the flow of young people into our criminal justice system. I'm a big proponent of thinking that if you stop, you look at things on a spectrum. If you stop the inflow of people into the criminal justice system at the young age, then I'd like to put some people out of business. And I'd like to put the criminal justice system out of business. So why don't we start helping our young people get the resources and services they need?
Thank you. Bob, we're going to shift specifically and think a little bit and talk about girls. Although national youth crime rates have declined over the years, today nearly 30% of the young people arrested are girls or young women, and their share of arrests, detainment, and court cases have steadily increased over the past 2 decades. What OJJDP policies and programs specifically address the needs of girls in or at risk of entering the juvenile justice system?
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. Let me be a little more specific on the numbers. Last year, approximately 1 million children were arrested, which means that approximately 300,000 girls were arrested across the nation. One of the things that we focused on is the National Girls Initiative. That initiative focuses both as a grant-making program as well as a clearinghouse. What Dr. Burke-Harris indicated is that we would like to have an opportunity so that every child who's going into our schools is screened for trauma and then provided with appropriate trauma-informed care. That's the same conclusion that the Attorney General's National Task Force on Children's Exposure to Violence reached. That's one of the highlights of that report. So in order to accomplish that, we need to make sure that the awareness of the problem is spread across the nation. So the National Girls Initiative serves as an organization to help bring about awareness. It's funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. In addition, we provide funding to the Vera Institute. We know that many of the young women who come into the system come in for status offenses. Those are runaways, truants, or children who are somehow connected with the school system and having problems within the school system. They're locked up because of those problems. So we want to reduce the number of status offenders who are coming into the system. We also provided guidance, a policy guidance from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention that helps people understand the nature of the problems and how girls end up in the juvenile justice system. The majority of girls who are coming in for assaultive behavior, simple assault, aggravated assault, sometimes in the context of domestic violence situations where there's a mandatory arrest requirement. Others are coming in because they're involved in commercial sexual exploitation. Some are being treated as prostitutes, which is wrong, since they are really victims. They can't possibly consent to the kind of behavior that they're involved in. One of the things I want to make absolutely clear is this. The federal government provides some of the funding to states that the states use for girls, but usually something less than 10%. So by raising the awareness, we can get the states across the nation to recognize the problem and become more engaged in providing their own funding to help address the problem. Part of the reason we have our public awareness campaign, which Carol referenced earlier, changingmindsnow.org, is that if we can raise the awareness across the nation, then people all over the nation will be seeking the answers to these problems that Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris mentioned, screening, and then appropriate trauma and trauma-informed care so that girls can get the right care in their own locations without ever coming into the juvenile justice system for a reference point.
Calvin, can I just mention one thing?
Yes,
I know
please.
I'm going off script. So one of the things I want to make sure that people understand is, in the last 3 years, our Office for Victims of Crime has received a huge increase in the amount of money released from the Crime Victims Fund to states for victim assistance. We're talking about billions. And so a lot of these girls, young people who are victims, and I think that you need to look creatively and think creatively about where the resources are that are in your communities and available to assist these young people and to see them as victims. So I encourage you to figure out who handles your victim assistance money in your state and to go see how it's allocated and go demand some of those resources to help you address these issues.
That is the perfect segue to what I was just about to ask Rebecca. Your center, along with the Ms. Foundation and Rights for Girls, has produced a study on girls and the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. I'd love for you to talk about that briefly, but also describe, as Carol has just talked about, how girls have been overlooked as victims in the whole arena of sexual violence and abuse.
Sure, so I'm going to expand a little bit on what Bob has already mentioned. We co-authored this report almost to produce a bit of a counterpoint to the school-to-prison pipeline narrative, which so often focuses on boys of color. And we sought to focus on the particular phenomenon of the criminalization of girls who are actually victims of sexual violence, which Bob was just referring to. And most of these girls, a large proportion of them are girls of color in particular. So the starkest example is the one that Bob just mentioned, which is victims of sex trafficking. For far too often, girls who are commercially sexually exploited and often are too young to even be of legal age to consent are treated as offenders. They are arrested on prostitution charges or related charges, and they're then put into contact with the juvenile justice system. But that's, of course, not the only other example. Bob was referring to status offenses where a girl might be running away from an abusive home. She may be truant, because she is being sex trafficked. But she can be brought into the juvenile justice system for those offenses as well, if there's a valid court order prohibiting them from running away from home or from being truant. Once they enter the juvenile justice system, a few things happen. It's very likely that those girls are going to be re-triggered because of the standard operating procedures within the juvenile justice system that are certainly not trauma-informed in most cases. And it's very unlikely that they're going to get the kind of health care they need: mental health care services, physical health services, and reproductive health services that should be available in juvenile justice facilities, but really often aren't the case. They may even be exposed to fresh incidents of abuse within the system as well. So then the cycle continues. They're released into the community. They have not been supported. They are back into the environment that may well re-abuse them, and back they go into the juvenile justice system again. So we have this very pretty infographic that's describing a very grim cycle in our report that talks about how this isn't so much a pipeline as a cycle that repeats itself.
Yeah.
Can I just add
Yes,
one
please do, please.
point? One point that I want to make also is that our data in California documented that if a person has experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, they are 11 times as likely to be a victim of sexual violence after the age 18. Right? So not included in their original ACEs, 11 times as likely. And so when we talk about some of these cycles and some of these patterns, again, it highlights the need for early identification, because if I see a young woman in my clinic and she's 14 years old and she has 4 ACEs, she's 11 times as likely to be a victim of sexual violence after the age of 18. And we can do that early identification and do the intervention to try and do some prevention in that situation. And that, I think, is the important take-home message, is that for a lot of us, when we look at this, there's so much that we can do. I think many folks don't have a sense that, oh, well, what do you do? Sure, how are you going to prevent women from being commercially trafficked? Actually, there's a very straightforward way we can do that.
So with the time we have left, and time is sort of slipping away before we see the film, I want to turn to solutions and healing and treatment and all of that good stuff. So Dr. Marins, I know that you've worked closely with several agencies at the Department of Justice. Would you share some of the solutions that you've discovered through your work, and perhaps a success story? And in that, if there is one change that you could make in our current justice system, particularly around trauma-informed systems and policing, would you speak to that?
Sure. I'm reminded, especially because of the passing of former Attorney General Janet Reno, that the beginning of the Justice Department taking leadership on these issues actually began in the early 90s. And then there was a hiatus, and then we picked up again. Leadership is absolutely essential in both helping us learn more and then translating what we've learned into delivering to the public the reality of hope that there are things that can be done to interrupt the cycle so that children are not broken and that families are not left feeling a continuation of helplessness that for many have existed for generations and generations. So the bottom line is that for decades and maybe centuries, leaving out all of the bad things that have happened in our country's history for a moment, the human experience of putting blinders on to things that we can't fix is part of our condition. And this is no more true than when police officers are responding to the horrific experiences that both adults and children experience on a daily basis throughout every shift of every police officer across the country. They keep the blinders on because they can't tolerate to see the agony and pain and the suffering of often the children that are left behind. What happens if we don't actually leave those officers to be attending to those families without any equipment? What happens if we bring to the mix partners who are willing to still make house calls 24/7? What happens if, rather than feeling helpless, they are trained to actually deliver one of the central parts of the brain function that are compromised in acute traumatic situations, the prefrontal cortex, executive functioning? These officers have demonstrated when they're trained and when they have partners, they can take the blinders off. And guess what? We all need someone to lean on sometimes. And instead of thinking about police as only the enemy, to think about them as our allies, to think about them as the people who have our backs when we are down, is a sea change that began with this Justice Department. And it is actually with enormous pride that I'm here today and have worked with my colleagues for so many years, because that experience alone has led us as the practitioners to get closer to the phenomena of individuals, to hear the stories, to observe the phenomena that has become the roadmap for developing an early intervention that, okay, it happened at Yale, but it's happening around the country. Beautiful things happening that can decrease the trajectory of the failure of recovery and increase the opportunity of recovery by strengthening families, by helping people learn to get control again of the symptoms that are the natural sequelae of overwhelming experiences, of nightmares coming true. We have longer-term treatments for those kids who don't do so well in the early phase of recovery. And we have an increasing array of institutions, emergency rooms, child welfare services that are now not only able to identify, which I completely is the starting point, but it's also an opportunity to now move forward with instituting and ensuring the spread of evidence-based treatments that can actually help kids be kids and grow into healthy adults.
Thank you. Thank you. Jamie, you have traveled all over the world with this film and in researching it. What have you seen in different places and parts of the world that you think can help heal a child, different solutions to the trauma that we're talking about?
So I don't know if you're referring to our work with the State Department with the American Film Showcase, which is a partner between USC and the State Department to take socially oriented documentaries abroad, give people a look at how Americans are dealing with tough issues. That may be what you're referring to. Frankly, I can't say that in my very limited experience that my eyes have been thrown wide open by things going on abroad. What I do see is that the essential truth of toxic stress and the ACE score and what it means to well-being and why it's so urgent, why it's so important to deal with it. All I see is just increasing and sometimes even sort of more dramatic examples of why it is important. And you take a country like Colombia that's been at war for 30 years, and you have generations of young children, and you hear from them about what does that mean. You think about toxic stress, and the conversations I've had maybe directly related to our film work has been a little bit more intimate than that. But boy, it can seem overwhelming. That doesn't mean that there aren't really, really empowering solutions out there. And really, I know I speak for Dana and Karen that if we had encountered the ACEs study, which is, it's hard information, right? I mean, the predictors, remember, there are risks. These are risks. This isn't a prognosis. It's a risk. So. But it's harrowing when you see what the risk is, but a risk means that, it doesn't have to be that way. And really, there's so many communities and sectors in America that are really leading the way in this. That isn't just, I would say, are there overlaps with restorative justice in New Zealand, for instance? Community-based, Maori, culture-based restorative justice overlaps a lot, in my opinion, with what you need to deal with toxic stress. You go on the Navajo Nation, and they're understanding that health is not something that you fix when you don't have it. Health is something that you create through the right community. And so you can see things like this, but we wouldn't have made these movies And people in this audience, Dr. David Johnson, for instance, and what he's doing with young children, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, if you're not impressed already, just hang in for another hour. They're all translating this science as the basis to changing things. I mean, I could quickly, guess what? The school resource officer at the high school that was subject to paper tigers looks nothing like the school resource officers that we're exposed to on YouTube. You see the things that go on YouTube with school resource officers, and it's harrowing. That's not the way the guy behaves at Lincoln High School. Lincoln High School also went out of their way on a community basis to create a health center right there at the school. Many of these kids were getting pediatric care for the first time in their lives. Right down to things that, in some ways, the great opportunity with the ACEs study is it gives you substance and science, and it gives you an intellectual and scientific apparatus to embrace things that somehow feel soft and light, such as compassion and empathy, curiosity, patience, the kinds of things that we all know are the right things in the way we deal with each other as people. And yet somehow it sounds sort of disenfranchising, doesn't it? When you use those words, it's like, oh, this guy must be from Northern California, which I am. But, you put the science in there, you weave it together, and amazing things happen.
Thank you. Carol?
So I was going to say that Dr. Marin's talked about tools, and so, am I taking what
go
you're
ahead.
going to say? So the Department of Justice is working with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to develop a tool, which we hope will be rolled out before we leave, to make sure that we are equipping law enforcement officers with the tools to deal with children, young people who are exposed to violence. We work closely with the school system and with school resource officers to begin training them about how do you recognize what's happening and how do you bring the social service resources and other people in to deal with these things. So I want to make sure that we've done a good job of trying to raise awareness of the issue, but we need to equally focus on what resources do your communities have to bring to bear to address them, because you've got to give people the tools to deal with it.
So Carol did take what I was going to say. I was just going to heap a lot of praise on my colleagues, because with the IACP, the Yale Child Study Center, and the DOJ have developed this toolkit that now will be available to law enforcement organizations throughout the country to begin to equip officers to help kids and families begin the process of recovering.
And I would just like to add, there are 3 types of programs that are currently reducing dramatically the number of kids who are coming into the juvenile justice systems from schools. First, there are civil citations throughout the state of Florida. Instead of getting arrested, kids get citations, get referred to get the appropriate type of behavioral health treatments and other kinds of treatments that they might need, including a treatment for substance abuse issues. Secondly, we have what's called the TESCI model, which is Memorandum of Understanding between the key stakeholders in juvenile justice systems. And we've been piloting this program in 16 different locations through the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And we've gotten some results back, but we are still working on that model. But we think that has great promise for working across the nation. The third model is one that's working through our Now is the Time grants in Philadelphia, where you have a law enforcement officer who's engaged in pre-arrest diversion. They've reduced the number of kids coming into the juvenile justice system from about 1,500 a year down to about 500 a year. That's in 2 years with the documentation going along with it. The other component that's critical is public awareness. And what we're doing at the Department of Justice is that we are training prosecutors, public defenders, judges, probation officers about adolescent development, about trauma, trauma-informed care, and evidence-based programs, so that they are aware of what the issues are, so when they see them, they can focus on coming up with some solutions. Finally, we've held, under the Support of School Discipline Initiative, 2 national conferences where people from states across the nation have come in teams, and we've educated them about the issues along with a lot of practitioners and a lot of advocates, so they are aware. So we're raising the awareness, providing practical solutions, encouraging people to experiment with with these specific programs we have, and there are several others that go along with it, so we can get some results and then point to those results and say, go work on those results because we know they work across the nation. So there's great promise, there are solutions, and also there's a tremendous amount of data through the data collection tools developed by the Department of Justice and also the Department of Education through the Civil Rights Division. So we have a lot of data that will tell you what's going on in your school district. If you want to find out about your school district, we can give you the tools so you can go look at what's happening in your school, in your neighborhood, and know whether there are disparities connected with children who are being removed from the school.
Thanks, Bob. And I want to go back first of all, thank you for anticipating my questions, everybody. But I want to go back to Dr. Burke-Harris, because you were talking about very practical things that everybody can do in their own communities to support children and families, in their schools, in their own neighborhoods.
Yes, I think there's a tremendous amount that we can do, particularly in creating safe, stable, and nurturing environments for kids. One of the most critical things that I think that we all can do, right, is to start at home and practice self-care. We know that one of the most important things to buffer the stress response of a child is a well-regulated and healthy adult to be able to provide a stable and nurturing relationship for that child. And I just want to emphasize that, keep in mind that between 33 states have looked at this, and between half and 2/3 of Americans have experienced at least one ACE, and between 11 and 17% have experienced 4 or more ACEs. This is in all communities. Among children in the National Child Health Survey, the highest rates were in Kentucky, Montana, and Ohio, right? This is all races, all ethnicities, and one of the things that we can do is figure out how do we care for ourselves to be a buffer to kids, how do we care within our families, and then we see programs across the country, like Turnaround for Children, that are doing this work in schools, like the National Crittenton Foundation that's doing this with parenting young moms. There's so much that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rebecca, I want to give you the last word on girls and on policy that you, I know, have worked hard on. If you could just really quickly tell us what policies are working and what's missing, what needs to change around girls and healing and overcoming trauma.
Well, I'll tell you some of my thoughts that I can add to what my colleagues have said. And one is we really need to include youth voices in crafting solutions, because we really can't, as a matter of policy, we can't really craft solutions if we're not consulting the experts, which is youth themselves. And the White House is leading in this way, and tomorrow they've invited girls to come and be in this room and give input into the solutions that we need to develop. I'm going to go off your question just a little bit to talk about another issue, because it really has to do with policy, which is a little bit different than treating isolated ACEs. When you view this film, you'll see one of the experts talk about how the ACEs study was the majority of the people who were assessed in the original ACEs study were white and college educated. And the point that he draws from that is, as you were pointing out, we can no longer say, I don't see these people. I think those were his words, that trauma only happens, or ACEs only happen to the other. And that is a really important point. It's very important to energize the work by acknowledging the universality of adverse childhood experiences that crosses race and gender and income lines. But the negative implication of that statement is that maybe there would be less investment in overcoming adverse childhood experiences if it didn't affect white, college-educated people. And what does that say about us and our interest in creating policy? So at least from the perspective of my work, it's important not to treat adverse childhood experiences in isolation, but to layer on the other forms of trauma, or to expand the framework to acknowledge who we are as complex individuals and the gender responsive and culturally competent nature of the solutions that we need to craft.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for bringing us this film. Thank you, everybody on the panel. And now we can watch the film.